Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move to the second topic, which is about this changing strategies on grades, trims, making it less flexibility maybe across country. And we've got Matt Freeman from CAP HPI, which of course can maybe even or afterwards in the expert panel talk a bit about the specific impact also from a UK point of view. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Johan. Good to be here.
I'm going to start again with a Slido question first. Good to hear what the impact or what the ideas is of people. Will this change, reducing flexibility, harmonize across Europe, have a negative effect on residual value? Will it have an effect on probably the fact that probably per country maybe you can't create the ideal vehicle anymore because there might be some restrictions? So what do you think? Yes, it will harm RVs. Yes, for sure. Not a real impact. No opinion. It's a bit mixed feeling so far. I'm going to follow it a bit. No, it will strengthen the RVs. That's an interesting one for you afterwards, Matt. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. Not really what I was thinking, Matt, that would come out, but that's why. Okay.
Nope. Changing again.
I was changing again. Okay, Matt, if you would like to share your screen and then please take it away.
Thank you, Johan. So good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk about future trim strategy and what I think is going to be the impact they will have on RVs. So I think to put this into context, it's probably worth looking at how complicated things had become. So I'm not picking on BMW here, but it's a good example is the BMW 3 Series saloon. So what I've done is I've looked at all the different variations that were offered of the saloon. So this covers powertrain, engines, fuel types, transmissions, drivetrains, as well as the trim strategy and any packs that were being offered. And you can see how as BMW progressed the 3 Series through its generations, it got more and more complicated till in the previous generation, the F30, you ended up with over 500 different variants. And this is obviously just for the UK alone, because this is using our CAP data. What led to a change? Well, there were two things. When the G20 version, the current version, came to market, we saw a big reduction of that. And one of the reasons was that the shift away from physical brochures and showroom sales into online configurators really made it clear how complicated things had become. I think it was much easier as a customer to look at a brochure and tick off the bits and pieces that you wanted to add to the vehicle. And of course, the manufacturer was very pleased to do that because it was a big source of extra revenue and profitability. And margins on options are generally very high. That made life a lot easier. And also, there was an attempt to try and appeal to absolutely everybody. And when you started to do this online with configurators, what you found was life was really, really complicated. You had multiple steps. You couldn't tell what things were. You couldn't compare things quite so easily. And I think that's one of the things that drove them to do that. The other thing was, and this is where the RV issue comes in, is people don't like confusion. They don't like uncertainty. And it became very difficult both for the wholesale and also retail customers to know what they were buying. There were multiple trims available on cars. And I say, we're not picking on BMW here. This is true across the marketplace. And it wasn't clear what they were. When you had, say, 2 or 3 or 4 trims on a vehicle, it was clear what you were buying. We ended up with a system for many cars where people just didn't really know. And that uncertainty led to them essentially being very cautious with what they were prepared to pay for those vehicles. So where are we now? Well, we're in a situation where we are already in a simplification world. So if you go on any configurator, you will be sort of led through a series of steps, and they're kind of all very much similar process. They take you from the model through the engine, trim line, and packs, and then you get to choose those personalization features like wheels and colors. What it hasn't done is actually taken away so much of the choice. If we look at just trim lines and packs and on the chart for the 3 Series, again, by generation, you can see that BMW had moved from having a lot of trims on F30 down to a much simpler arrangement of 4 trims, but then they started adding those packs in, and those packs, of course, designed to give customers much more choice, but a guided choice. And of course, there was a drive there, not just to attempt to get away from this complexity, which was sapping some of the residual value, but also, of course, if you think about the manufacturing process, it created much simpler scheduling for manufacturing of vehicles. And another advantage, of course, was you had faster delivery, because if you are reducing the amount of complexity, you are essentially reducing the amount of choice the customer has, then it becomes easier to schedule vehicles and to track demand accordingly and get those vehicles into the hands of customers that little bit faster. OEMs, of course, also, as we've just seen from the survey, the assumption was that would also drive up RVs, but we'll talk about that in a second. More recently, of course, we've had a number of specific factors which have forced OEMs across the world to simplify their product offering to customers. I don't think I need to explain the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects on that, but just to summarize, it obviously hit initially the supply of vehicles full stop, and in most markets we're still under supplying vehicles. For a lot of manufacturers, it's still an issue to be able to get anywhere near the volumes that they were doing before COVID hit. Here in the UK, we would normally expect a market of in excess of 2 million, between 2.5 million units for passenger cars per annum. We're still at 1.6, and we've been at that level now for the last couple of years. And that has forced manufacturers to be selective in what they put into the marketplace. They are generally looking at the most attractive trims to the customers, and focused very much therefore on residual value as well as the new market, to ensure that what they put out there performs as well as it possibly can. So we've also seen the reduction of a lot of lower trims. That's something that we've always had in the UK marketplace, partly driven by the very strong performance of PCP finance in the private marketplace, which allows the salespeople to walk people up into higher trims quite quickly, because of it's a monthly payment, of course, rather than a headline figure. But then when we start adding to all the other factors that we've had, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which had obviously very specific effects on some of the supply chain areas like steel and some of the electrical features for vehicles, that's caused problems. Pressures on the labour market with changes in people's working patterns. Of course, we now have the impact of inflation, and even things like the theft of vehicles and their parts. All of this has forced manufacturers to cut down what they can do in order to focus on what they're able to do and able to put into the marketplace. One of the things, though, about features on vehicles, about trims and about options and about packs, is that what we still find is it's the traditional features that drive a lot of residual value. So once you take away the factor of the vehicle itself, the performance, the fuel economy, and all of those things that are sort of built into that vehicle, the features that you're adding to the vehicle are very much the traditional features, and very much the features that you can see or touch. So things like LED lights, which change the appearance of the car, and alloy wheels, a personalization feature, big ticket obvious items like panoramic roofs, leather, interiors, bitone paint, satellite navigation, and increasingly it's really down to the screen and the configuration of the screens in the car. They are still big drivers of value. And one of the reasons for that is that when we think about how used cars are sold, well, first of all, there's an identification issue, which I'll pick up on in a second. But there's really the fact that if you're buying a new car, you're probably buying a new car with a lot more information. You know, the website will be dedicated to those new products. You'll have all the information that you need. If you are looking at buying a used car and you're out on you're out on a site looking at used cars, there isn't always that much information available to you. The sales teams dedicated though they are not trained up as product specialists in the same way that the new car sales teams are. They have to cover many more products. So those visual features are the ones that drive the value in trim and the value in packs. And so consequently, we still see a lot of that value. That, of course, raises the question about where does the value come in for invisible features, things like technology, safety features, driving aids, and so forth. And the answer is they don't seem at the moment to have that much residual value impact unless they're properly explained to customers. And as I like to say, you find that very well on a new car. You struggle sometimes to see it on used vehicles. And it's certainly something that when we talk to manufacturers, and I work in the consulting team at CAP HPI, and we work on residual value projects with OEMs, that one of the things we're very keen to get across is that you won't get value for features, for trims, for options, for packs, unless you explain the value to the customer. And it's not just the new customer, it's the used customer. And let's not forget that that new customer base is complicated enough as it is. If we think about all the different diversities of people that are buying cars, all the different needs they have, it's actually quite difficult to kind of narrow those things down. I mean, I've just played with what I think people would appeal to different kind of customer groups here. I'm not making any judgments around people. But, if you look at things like, how important are features like alloy wheels, leather interior, satellite navigation, paint, LED lights, that's just to explain what the icons on the left are supposed to be. You can have an enormous variety of appeal across different groups of people. And one of the reasons that we ended up with that very complicated structure of trims was because we were trying to appeal to everybody. So something's got to give. And it becomes even more complex when we start, as I say, to take the used car market into consideration as well. We're looking at a diversity of consumers there, but we're also taking into account the fact that they may have less disposable income, that they are probably choosing a vehicle maybe for different reasons. It may be a second vehicle rather than the primary vehicle in their household. All of those features then start to change their factor. Their valuation factor. So it becomes a big issue for us as RV analysts to be able to track all of that complexity. There's also the issue to take into account of, as I say, identifying where the value is. And this, again, is something which we think is really, really important and that OEMs and others need to be aware of. If you look at the UK marketplace, how do you identify what a vehicle is? How do you identify what trim content is? How do you identify what packs have been added onto those vehicles? In the UK, obviously we have a plate, we have a number plate like everyone else, but we have a number of organisations which code those vehicles. So we have the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, which is the government body that registers vehicles, licenses vehicles, and they have one set of system of documentation. You then have the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, which is the trade body for the industry in the UK. They have a coding system. Then you have organisations like ourselves, like CAP HPI. We have coding systems, and those coding systems link through to things like specification data, our used values, new values, forecasts, and so forth. And you need to be able to track the vehicle through its life using these multiple codes. And in some cases, these coding systems may not pick things up. We at CAP HPI, for instance, are very keen to ensure that when OEMs are launching a vehicle, they understand what they will and won't get coding for. We will generally create codes for trims and packs which do have residual value impact, positive impact. But other parts of that life cycle, that chain of organizations don't necessarily do that. And consequently, as a vehicle progresses through its life, and particularly as it becomes a little bit older, some of that residual value can be lost because it simply isn't possible to identify through unless you've got coverage of all these coding systems, what's actually in the car and what's on the car and where that value sits. There's another factor which doesn't so much impact us here in the UK, but is certainly more of a factor across across the European markets, the continental European markets, and that's the cross-border trading issue. So the dotted line is nothing to do with Brexit. I should point out it's simply obviously that the UK and the Republic of Ireland, we are right-hand drive markets. I know there are a couple of other right-hand drive markets on that map, but generally, of course, we don't tend to export vehicles from outside of from the UK to many other markets, but within Europe, it is a factor which is often taken into account. And sometimes that's focused on particular technologies. Sometimes it's focused on the seasonality of certain markets or the shape of certain market demand cycles or demand sectors. And if we start narrowing down the availability of options, particularly to fleet operators who may be the first user, then you would find that there would be a loss of potentially a loss of value, particularly if you are bundling into a trim or into a pack features which simply don't appeal in other marketplaces. So you may be putting things onto a car in Spain, which ultimately will be transported to Northern Europe, and the question is, well, does that add? Do all those features add value when perhaps in the past you may have only needed to add one or two options, or you may have had a simpler trim that was suitable for that market and was also suitable for the export market. If you're looking at certain other features within a vehicle, then if things like premium features on premium vehicles, then again, which parts of that marketplace do those things appeal to more than others? So I've just been asked a question. I'm wondering about premium or branded sound systems and whether that creates uplift on residual value. And again, it's down to the customer. We always say that it's the customer that decides the residual value of a vehicle. Our job, and I'd be interested to know the views of my colleagues on here. We all are trying to estimate what the future value of something is, and in most cases, that's really down to what the customer is going to pay for it. It's not how much it costs to develop or how much it costs to install. So if you look at some of those very high premium features, and you look at, for instance, premium sound systems or premium features around interior trim and so forth, are those things desirable in that used marketplace? And one of the things that we have seen recently is that manufacturers are focusing very much on higher spec. As I say, because they're forced to cut down on what they can put out, they're trying to put out what they think are the most premium vehicles that they can produce, and that those vehicles will have the highest residual values. And it needs to bear in mind that isn't always the case. It's not just a matter of saying that things like high-end leather just doesn't improve residual value at all. It does, but only on certain vehicles. And the same is true of high-end features like sound systems. On a very premium product, you would see a desire amongst the customer for that. On a more mainstream product, it's just not going to have the same impact. And that's interesting because also, again, as I say, it ties in with the technology issue. The more technology that you put into a vehicle, it doesn't necessarily increase the residual value, because you're thinking about what that used buyer is going to think of that technology, and whether they're in many cases actually going to even know what it's for or what advantages it brings to them. And that brings me to what I think is probably where the end game of this. We're used to cars being fixed. When they leave the factory, they have a fixed specification. They have certain features, and you can get a car reupholstered or you can change the wheels, but generally speaking, the technology built into the vehicle is there for life. We're now moving into a period where that's changing, and that's creating a huge challenge for everybody. So FOD is function on demand, so you can choose what goes into the car. You can even take things off if you want to. There are great advantages for customers here. Customers can pick and choose which features they want. They can add features for a period of time. They can add features in the winter, like heated seats or heated steering wheel, and then remove it during the summer. And they only pay for 3 or 4 months of use of that feature, instead of having to pay several £100, euros, whatever, at the start of the life of the car. It makes life easier for fleets. They can optimize the specification of the car for the fleet and not necessarily have to have that fixed. They can remove it, or they can add things on that they would not normally want their fleet users to use. And for used buyers, they can actually now essentially be like a new buyer. They could create the car that they want by adding those features on. The challenge it creates for us is, does that create a naked car? So if those features are available, is that value? Or is it only value if it's actually on the car? And so as we move forward, I think, the question, is the trim strategy currently creating better residual values? That's questionable, but it's only going to be part of the process we go through as we move towards a much more flexible way of ordering and specifying our cars into the future. Johan.
So I think you would almost agree that it looks a bit more challenging in the first years, maybe, but when it comes to FOD, it could create an opportunity. But salespeople of used cars will be probably having a huge impact if they can sell it, actually.
Yeah,
if they can
and
sell it.
to say, for us, it's one thing we're always very keen to stress, that it's the used buyer that decides how much the car is worth. And if you can positively influence that buyer, you can influence the residual value. It's as important as, particularly with a big wholesale market like the UK, how you remarket your cars, how you manage them into the used market. You've then got to manage them into the hands of the next buyer. And with FOD coming, that's really going to be an added challenge, but an added opportunity as well.
Okay, Matt, thanks. We will see you just after the other expert speaker in our discussion panel. So thanks a lot for this input.